Ladies and gentlemen, I am Carl Pettis, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Alabama State University. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, President Quentin T. Ross Jr., and ASU faculty, staff, and students, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this voting rights program, from redistricting to gerrymandering, when the past meets the present. The National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at ASU is hosting this program as part of its Civil Rights Lecture Series on current topics and events that can potentially shape our future. I would like to thank the National Center Steering Committee under the direction of Project Director and Dean, Dr. Janice Franklin, and historian, Dr. Howard Robinson, for their work to present this outstanding voting rights lecture series. We hope that you will enjoy this informative presentation.
Hello and welcome. We bring you greetings on behalf of the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University. Today we are happy to host this very important voting rights lecture that speaks to our mission to serve as a research center, a living museum, and a repository of information relevant to the study of civil rights and African American culture. Today's program, which will be aired in two parts, will focus on redistricting and gerrymandering. These politically charged issues are important to understand in a dynamic democratic society where the past meets the present as we confront new challenges to the future of our democracy. Our center has established this lecture series as a way of honoring the rich history of the 1965 voting rights campaign, and ASU's role in voting rights history. We appreciate the support of all of you in our audience, and we want to thank our president, Dr. Quentin Ross, our provost, Dr. Carl Pettis, and the entire community as we seek to teach and preserve the legacy of the modern civil rights movement. It is our hope that you will enjoy the presentations from our esteemed guest speakers as they discuss these very urgent social justice issues. Again, welcome and thank you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Howard Robinson, Associate Library Director and Alabama State University historian. I am moderating today's program, the first of two discussions on redistricting. The title of today's program is From Redistricting to Gerrymandering, When the Past Meets the Present. This is the first of a two-part series intended to explore the process of political redistricting and explain when that process is manipulated and thereby becomes gerrymandering. We have several panelists who will provide historical context, explore the process of redistricting that is now taking place throughout the nation, and we will explain some of the legal challenges launched against the redistricting plans, both past and present, with a particular focus on the state of Alabama. By the way of background, every member of the United States House of Representatives, most of our state legislators, and many of our local representatives in towns and counties across the nation are elected from districts. Until the 1960s, across this country, political districts were malapportioned, or many of them were, with some congressional districts having 10,000 citizens and other districts with 400,000 citizens. And despite census data indicating significant population changes, these boundaries were never redrawn to ensure congressional districts had approximately the same number of people. In 1964, the United States Supreme Court in Westbury versus Sanders ruled that states must redraw their federal congressional districts to contain roughly equal populations, establishing the one man, one vote principle. Now, every 10 years after the decennial census, political lines are redrawn to reflect population shifts, with the purpose of ensuring that nearly equal numbers of citizens are distributed amongst the various districts. What typically happens, however, is that the political party in control of the redistricting process often draws political boundaries that gives an advantage to one party over another, or to one racial group over another. This is the process we call gerrymandering. In 1960, the Supreme Court in Gomillion versus Lightfoot agreed with attorney Fred Gray's argument that the state of Alabama violated the 15th Amendment when it redrew city boundary lines for the purpose of denying equal representation to African Americans. Racial gerrymandering became more difficult, however, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Special procedures were outlined in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This language required covered jurisdictions to pre-clear with the United States Justice Department any changes to voting laws that might have an impact on minorities. A covered jurisdiction is a state or local government with a history of voter discrimination and or low ethnic or language minority turnout. In today's discussion, we'll explore the long battle against racial gerrymandering waged by African Americans and the political organizations they represent, or that represent them. We will also explain the oversight role played by the federal government, specifically efforts within the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and how that division worked to address voter suppression and dilution, particularly as it relates to redistricting and gerrymandering in Alabama. To shed light on this important topic, we have two distinguished guests. First, we have Dr. Joel Reed, retired educator and chair of the Alabama Democratic Conference. And also we have John Tanner, former chief of the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. In the first part of our program, I'll ask our panelists a series of questions. After the panelists address these questions, we'll take questions from the audience. So throughout the discussion, post your questions in the chat box and we'll address as many questions as possible. I'd like to first turn my attention to Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, could you tell us a little bit about, or could you share some of your background in not only in politics, but in political organizing?
First, thank you for inviting me to participate on this program. And it's a pleasure as well as a privilege to be on the program with such esteemed civil rights lawyers as Attorney Jim Blackshear, who is, in my opinion, one of the most able and eloquent and informed lawyers on voting rights in about this country. And the other one, of course, is Attorney John Tanner, who also worked for the Department of Justice, and that who's informed and been so helpful in much of where we are today, particularly in legislative reapportionment and many others, because he was in the Department of Justice when we had his Section 5 division. And of course, there are others on this program who also participated a lot, but those who have been up front with us in terms of making significant change for Black representation. My involvement in, now I'll talk about the Voting Rights Act, and of course, my involvement in reapportionment. In 1970, I ran for the legislature of Alabama from Perry, Marengo, and Sumter counties. Little did I know that the district lines had been drawn in such a way that I was not going to win with polarized voting in the state of Alabama. I had Perry, Marengo, and Sumter County. I could carry Perry, I could carry Sumter, but Marengo County, I could not carry. And that time we had multi-member districts. So I lost that race for the legislature of Alabama. And then, of course, in 1975, Montgomery changed its form of government from a mayor council from a commission form of government to a mayor council form of government. And when the district lines were drawn by some third parties outside of Montgomery, there were 7 districts drawn, and of course, 9 districts drawn. 2 were majority Black, 7 were majority white, and splitting Alabama State straight down South Jackson Street, dormitories on girls' dormitory on one side and the boys on the other. And of course, I hit the ceiling, and I said, well, I draw my own districts. And that was why I started really drawing district lines in 1975. And ultimately, we drew the lines in such a manner that we had 4 majority Black districts and 5 majority white districts. And at that time, Montgomery was a majority white town. So that was where we got started in drawing a reapportionment plans. There were several of the legislative plans that came up later on that involved us. And of course, Jim Blackshear was one of the lawyers for us at that particular time, and that he was a lead lawyer in the case called Burden versus Hobby. That case where we drew a reapportionment plan that a redistricting plan that ultimately increased Black representation, and we also preserved county lines at that particular time. But it started with the need. And my goal, like I think all redistricting plans set out, the drafter has a goal in mind. People say, well, he drew it without drew with neutrality. I don't think anybody draws a plan with neutrality. You draw a plan with a goal you want to achieve. My goal was simple, was to get more Black representation in the halls in every chamber of government in Alabama, including the Alabama legislatures. So when I was drawing the plans, and Jim and Blackshear and company were looking at them and advocating them in court, our intent was to increase Black representation. And of course, we had a good backstop in Washington with John Tanner in the voting rights section. And I recall vividly, and I'll stop with this. I recall vividly when we took our plan to Washington the first time around, we had a plane load of folk, including a lot of Blacks. And somehow some folks felt that we were not going to win the second round. In that time, I think Jim Blackshear, Tony Harrison, and John Tanner, and might have been 2 other people there. But ultimately, John Tanner was the backstop. Brad Reynolds was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at that particular time. We ultimately prevailed in the Justice Department and ultimately prevailed in court and in court as well as the legislature. So it was all about kind of being forced into it one way, my involvement, because we were going to get black representation. We had to go fight for it ourselves. And thank God we had an able lawyer. We had another able lawyer, John Tanner, in the Justice Department, and a friend.
And
That makes a world of difference.
That provides us with a good segue. I'd like to introduce or to bring to the fore Mr. Attorney Tanner and have him talk a little bit about his work with the voting section of the Civil Rights Division in the United States Justice Department. You know, just the scope of your work and the breadth and depth of what you were doing with the Justice Department.
Well, thank you. I'm like Dr. Reed, I'm honored to be here, and I'm especially honored to be here with Dr. Reed, who has, I think, created the strongest Black political organization in the country here in Alabama for many, many years. And my thanks to Provost Pettis and Dr. Franklin and you, Dr. Robinson, for having me here. I started in the Justice Department as a paralegal and went to law school at night and worked full time. And then I became an attorney and they hired me on. And then my job was to litigate cases under the Voting Rights Act, and also including in my paralegal time to help analyze changes in voting practice, including redistricting plans, to determine whether or not they were discriminatory. Under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, if Alabama or a city or county in Alabama wanted to change their districting plan or move a polling place or do anything else affecting voting, they'd have to come to our office or to the federal court in Washington and establish that the change would not be racially discriminatory. Very strong statute. And my job was throughout really was to get the facts, to dig and get the facts and get them in solidified so that they could be introduced in court if necessary. That was what I did until I became the head of the voting section, at which time I tried to persuade other attorneys to be proactive and to get out there and work hard and get facts we could introduce in court and make change. But on the, Dr. Reed mentioned the state legislative redistricting in the 80s in Alabama, which was a big one. And what my role as the attorney involved in it was to look at all the census data in Alabama with great care to see what the alternatives were, alternatives to configuring districts, and to ask the Dr. Reed and other people, existing members of the legislature and Mr. Blacksher, what they thought of it, and then check that to make sure that it aligned with the facts. And then I'd ask the state why they did things and check with them to make sure they had the facts. And in that case, the state had clearly discriminated. I think I am confident that there was not one single place across the state of Alabama where they had a chance to minimize the right of Black citizens to vote, that they didn't do it. It was about as bad a plan as I've seen. And working with Dr. Reed and others, and Dr. Reed was very, very helpful in getting the details and the facts and local knowledge. With them, you know, the state came up with a plan, and we told them that it was no good and told them why, and they came up with another plan and another plan and another plan. And finally, the federal court in Burton v. Hobby that Dr. Reed mentioned said, well, enough of this, everyone, we're going to go ahead with the plan with one thing that hadn't been fixed, and then y'all get to run again in another year instead of 4 years, and that made everyone. That's sort of a come to Jesus moment. Alabama legislature, and they got the thing straightened out, and it was a big deal. It's probably one of the most rewarding things I did at the Justice Department, in part because I grew up in Alabama and I'd been a page in the Alabama legislature when the word came down they're going to have to start redistricting before anyone listening to this was born.
Attorney Tanner, so your career really starts after the implementation of the 65 Voting Rights Act. So your whole enforcement experience has been in the aftermath of that act, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. And the first phase of the act was just getting people registered to vote. There are places like Wilcox County, which is in Lowndes County, both of which have very large Black population majorities, where there was 0 Black citizens registered to vote. And the Voting Rights Act mandated, gave the Attorney General power to send in federal registrars to register people to vote where the local folks wouldn't do it. And I was living in Birmingham, and when I was about 15, 16 years old, I guess, I'd go down and take people, knock on doors and the projects really, and urge people to go in and register to vote, walk down there with them. And that was the first phase. But by the time I grew up and the Army let me go, we're in the second phase, and that was letting people get elected. Got the people there, but the cards were stacked against them, as Dr. Reed mentioned. And
from a federal standpoint, what did you see were the impediments to getting people elected, particularly African Americans elected?
The big thing for starting was to get rid of at-large elections, where all of the county commissioners in Conecuh County, Alabama, for example, were elected by all the voters. And the county was about 45% Black. And so that with the racial block voting that existed, they didn't stand a chance. And so one of the many suits in Conecuh County was to get them to change to a single member district system. And the first hammer we had on them was that before the Voting Rights Act, like many places, they had districts. They only had 2 districts, but they had districts. And when the Voting Rights Act was passed, or when it was looming, they changed it to at-large elections so that the white majority, or in many cases, a white minority, could retain control. And that was the first phase. And then once you have districts, then how are you going to draw them, which is what we're talking about this evening. And they were drawn in a racially discriminatory manner.
So, and one last question before I turn it back to Dr. Reed. So you've had opportunities to chime in and examine and voting rules and changes both in Alabama and Mississippi. What were and I would characterize the redistricting process, and particularly if it's abused, as part of vote dilution process. So if you agree with that assessment, then what were the most egregious efforts in your career to minimize or to disenfranchise the African American population in Alabama?
Well, in Alabama, in the early phases, of course, people were shot and killed, and there was a great deal of violence. Once the Voting Rights Act was passed, that changed a lot in Alabama and in Mississippi. And one reason was the politicians quit campaigning by yelling a certain word over and over again. You know, it gave the Black community some power. And I've got to hand it to Dr. Reed and the ADC. One thing they did was endorse a whole slate of candidates, and not just rate contests in which Black candidates were running, but in all the races. And they hold and still hold sessions where the candidates can come to them and make promises and keep some of them eventually. And so that created situational allies for them. So if I have the ADC endorsement, I'm not going to be messing with their voting rights. I want them to vote.
Right.
And that, I think that was a brilliant move that I haven't seen in any other state. And I mainly did Alabama, Mississippi, but I've done stuff from Miami to Seattle and from San Diego to Boston. And people, when pressed, do pretty much the same sort of stuff.
I would like to turn to Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, you had the experience, or your political life sort of stems back before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I think that the ADC was organized in 1960, and you came on, shortly after it was organized. But could you tell us a little bit about how, in your experience, both as an individual, but also with the ADC, the Alabama Democratic Conference, how the Voting Rights Act influenced or impacted the way that you all operated?
Well, the Voting Rights Act made ADC stronger. Let me say in the outset, I'm not a founder of ADC. The Alabama Democratic Conference was founded by some gentlemen who were older than I am, and they pushed the ADC off in my lap because I was the executive secretary of the Alabama State Teachers Association, the statewide teachers union. That was my position at that time. Arthur Shores and Rufus Lewis, Dr. C.G. Gomillion, Peter Hall, David Hood, Eisen Clement, and a few others. They were the one who were really carrying ADC, and it was kind of spotty. It depends on the influence that the individual had that I just named. But I did not found the organization. But in 1970, we met at the Whitler Hotel, and Rufus Lewis had been chair. We had just left the 1968 Democratic Convention, where John Cashin, and I praise him to a large extent because John Cashin pressured the regular Democratic Party to really give blacks more recognition. And John was not going to get that recognition, and he didn't get it, but he challenged the Alabama Democratic Party in Chicago in 1968. And he claimed that the Alabama Democratic Party was a Wallace party, and therefore they shouldn't be seated. The Alabama Democratic Party was not a Wallace party. Now, John Cashin was wrong with that, but overall his spirit was give black more representation, and that was his ploy. But then ultimately the regular Democrats in Alabama were seated. But the key to the whole thing was that in 1968, as Howard Heflin said, that the Democratic Party was saved by Bob Vance and Joe Reed, and of course others, C.G. Gomillion, Arthur Shores. They were all there, and they made a big difference in whether Alabama got seated or not. So after that, that's 68, 1970, Rufus Lewis and the guy came and said, look, why don't you over the teachers organization, why don't you chair the ADC? Well, it didn't bother me. I said, yeah, we'll do it. And we set out to do that. And one of the things that I set out to do was to involve every county in the state in the decision-making of ADC, being on the executive committee, one thing. Another thing was very crucial That was every county, the state organization would not get in any county races because, believe it or not, the sheriff, the probate judge, those folks had far more influence and impact on how the counties felt about politics than the president or the governor. So that helped a whole lot. And many other things working across the state. And I was gaining some momentum and some support and have a few successful things, litigating cases for black teachers. That didn't hurt ADC, that helped. And in 1969, when ASTA and the Alabama Education Association met, we put it, Bob Ingram wrote in one of his columns that was a marriage made in heaven. What we had was we put the progressive whites in AEA with the blacks. And that gave Paul Hubbard and it gave me, the two of us, the majority to move AEA forward. And moving AEA forward, and it didn't take Paul Hubbard long to realize how much the black vote meant to education. And so we put together the two, and that made it go. We identified the teachers with the civil rights movement. As Dr. King, last trip into Montgomery, Alabama, at Maggie Street Baptist Church, had me to stand. And he thanked me for, as he put it, identifying the teacher with the civil rights movement. That was his last trip in Montgomery. So all of these factors impacted the growth, the strength of ADC. And then AEA provided ADC a lot of money. Well, that's a lot of money. A lot of ADC's money. It wasn't a lot of money of ADC's money. A lot of it came AEA. AEA was funded. And we had lawyers working for AEA. They worked for ADC too. So we had a big thing going. It all worked out. And it helped us for 40 some years. But it was a combination of a lot of things that impacted the growth and the strength of ADC and what we were doing. And the masses were helped so much.
Let me ask you this,
yeah,
Dr. Reed. It appears as though that redistricting and redrawing lines to give the African American candidates an opportunity to win. That seems like it was a major part or a significant part of what ADC was doing. Am I right in that? And could you talk a little bit about that?
You are right in that. That was part of it. He was part of it. But I'll say this, and I know you'll come on after a while. One of the things that helped us a whole lot too with the ADC, what I call the masses, those who were not teachers. One of the things that helped us too, we had, as I said earlier, we had good lawyers. Jim Blackshear was a hell of a good lawyer. Win, lose, or draw. And I remember once we were down in, when I was doing the Burton versus Harvey plan, I remember showing to him down in Mobile. I went to J.T. Gaines' funeral, and we stayed at a hotel the next couple of days going over the plan. And Jim Blackshear was on the floor looking at the plan just like I was. So Jim Blackshear was very much familiar with the plan, and of course, certainly familiar with the law. So all of these together, I don't pick out one thing. And we had a couple other rallying points that was very helpful too, and that was the appointment of black federal judges. It was a crusade. It was a crusade when we got ready to appoint the black federal judges. Marvin Thompson and of course U.W. Clement. Those were ours, and ADC came out first for the black federal judges. I led that fight. I mean, everybody helped, but it was my responsibility. It was my thing to drive, because I've always believed in the federal judiciary. But we had all of these things going, and they was coming in at one time, different places, but they were all good. So in one thing, no. Many things, yes. That's what made the ADC as strong as it was. And then you had the big Heflin election. At that time, we had 2 United States senators be up for election. For one a few times, because Jim Allen had died and John Sparkman had retired. So we had that going. And all of these, so everybody was involved in the fight for the black federal judges. We were united. We were united. Mm-hmm. And the black for real, and the fight for reapportionment, we were united because black folks were hungry for black representation. whether it was in the legislature or wherever it was. And so all of that was going, and ADC was identified with all of that.
I
And we
want
were
to
succeeding.
turn.
And you know how success goes. Nothing breeds success like success. And there we were.
I'd like to turn to Attorney Tanner once again. Attorney Tanner, the early in the program, as a prelude, I talked about the redistricting process and then the transition between, or the difference between redistricting and gerrymandering. And one, I'd like you to clarify that or talk a little bit about that. Attorney Tanner, accessible?
Are you talking to me?
No, I'm talking. Yeah, I think we might have lost Attorney Tanner. Okay.
Tanner. Okay, yeah, John. Yeah, John.
Yeah, John Tanner.
Yeah,
Okay, there you are. Okay, so I did want you to I talked earlier in the program about this redistricting as a straightforward process, but then it becomes gerrymandering when people try to manipulate that process for a particular political or racial end. I really am interested to see, you talked earlier about how plans submitted by the state of Alabama had to be submitted multiple times, and still it was very difficult to come up with a solution. Over the course of your tenure, did you see the redistricting process become more open, or did the parties come together, or was it always contentious and always steeped in advantage or attempting to gain advantage?
Yeah, it's always steeped in advantage, and it these days it's all on party. In the early days, it was on race and also very much on individual personality. They say if you want a friend in redistricting, get a dog. You can have a computer draw a plan that is neutral. You just have to give it some contours. As a matter of fact, the state of Alabama used a plan in 1970, I believe, that was based entirely on equalizing the number of people and drawing fairly compact districts. And it was a mess. It didn't follow county lines. I imagine it was impossible to figure out where the lines were. And as it happened, it was put into place right before the big final school desegregation order, which moved population all around. And so it was, there are many white people fleeing areas where they'd go to formerly all black schools, and black people moving into new areas. And that really affected the districting, because there were districts in Jefferson County. I remember there were no majority black districts in Jefferson County in 1970, but by 1974 there were two, as a result of the movement of population. So redistricting is a very complicated thing. There are a lot of ways that you can game the system, and there are not many things that are hard and fast that can't be manipulated. One of them, Dr. Reed mentioned in connection with the Burton v. Hobby case, is following county boundaries, which is a good government thing. And, you don't change county boundaries. They hadn't changed in Alabama since, I think, 1905, when Houston County was added.
Yeah.
So that cabins what people can do in playing games. Everything else you can use it to your own advantage.
So we have one of the comments by a viewer who asked, what can a citizen of Montgomery do to create a more equitable redistricting process? Is it something that the layperson could do to interject or intervene in this process?
Well, I'll say that, well, Dr. Reed is not a public official, but he's certainly active in it. And you don't really, it helps to have a big organization behind you that can get you the computer stuff. But most of this, the computer data and the mapping programs are available online, and their organizations set them up. And anyone who wants to can draw a districting plan for whatever state or whatever city or county they want to. And, it's a complicated business. And, you got to be able to work with the computers and stuff and have access to the facilities at Alabama State, for example.
You want to chime in on that, Dr. Reed?
I have a simple answer for a complex solution. If you want to draw one equity, draw your own plan.
Okay.
Draw your own. Whatever you want to get, if you want a plan to turn out a given way, you draw it yourself. Supervise the drawing. To get what you really want to get. Because the machines, as John said, the machines are so, the data is so, it's everybody can get it, and you can draw one. You can draw one with almost precise.
Now, let me
Draw
ask
your
this.
own plan. That's mine. That's the simple solution.
Let me ask this
to answer your question.
Earlier in the program, actually prior to the program, we had a number of slides that reflected some facts or information about the redistricting process and the political voting process. One of those, we looked at a map that looked at different states and how those states conduct redistricting. And it looks like the vast majority redistricted through the state legislatures. But others had these commissions and other types of bodies or combination of bodies who looked at redistricting. How much traction has a neutral redistricting process gained in with the Department of Justice or even in political circles?
Well, the Department of Justice has a very limited role in it, really. We have authority if the plan is racially discriminatory, and that's it. If it benefits the Democrats, it benefits the Republicans, benefits rich people, poor people. The only thing that justice can weigh in on is race. Now, the commissions have spurts of popularity, and used to be Iowa was the only state that did it, and others have. California has one, in the states in your slide have redistricting commissions, and in Florida they don't have a commission, but they have guidelines, standards, and the state Supreme Court decides whether whatever the legislature does fits those, and if not, to send it back. And in Virginia and Ohio, they have commissions, but the commissions, like so many things these days, fell apart. They're pretty evenly balanced, and they couldn't get any agreement on anything. And so I don't, in Virginia, the court took it over and hired their own special master and drew their own plan, or had him draw their plan. In Ohio, they're still figuring out what to do. But and there are legal issues about whether a state court has the authority to draw plans unless the state constitution specifically allows it. Everything about redistricting has legal issues.
I have a question again for Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, the ADC, like you said earlier in the program, yourself and the ADC had a strategy of attempting to or working towards creating situations, redrawing or drawing districts that gave the greatest opportunity for Black representation. It seems like that's been turned on its head in that there's an attempt to sort of concentrate or create these super black or super democratic districts, so that you have other districts or more districts that have either white, majority white populations, or majority in the state of Alabama, majority Republican populations. So what do you see as how do you see that being addressed as we move forward?
I missed one little part.
Okay. It seems like that the ADC was wanted to create districts that gave a greater chance for African Americans to be elected to office. And I think that your opponents then started to concentrate or create these super majorities of black folks in a concentrated district, and so that you didn't have black folks or Democratic influence in other districts. And I say that because in the state of Alabama, almost the Democratic Party is significantly black, and the Republican Party is almost entirely white.
Well, I guess you're talking about packing,
right?
Where some districts have far more blacks in them than needed to win an election.
Correct.
Now, there are some of us who got different views about that, and that's okay. That's all right. We're all friends, but we still got different views about it. The last time we went to the U.S. Supreme Court, the case of the Alabama Democratic Conference and the legislative Black Caucus, when we were discussing this in the ADC headquarters as to what to do, how we were going to do when the court had ruled against all of us. Well, it was my position then, and it was later on confirmed last week for the first time, that not confirmed by the court, but it was my position. There was Gamillion versus Lightfoot in reverse. Well, Gamillion versus Lightfoot had they had taken the whites out of the city of Tuskegee so that they couldn't vote, and then in Montgomery, District 70 was Senate District 7 to 26. We packed so many in the district, and so that we couldn't have any influence in the outcome, and that's what they're doing now. I've drawn a legislative reapportionment plan that I thought was a better plan than the legislature passed, but there we are. I'll say more county lines. The districts are not as low in black population as some of the other plans are, but it's higher than some of these other plans. But I think it takes a few more blacks to win the elections if certain things happen. So overall, the thing that my goal was, and I'm not I could say I may be mentally a quota person. I'm not certain that I am. I don't think they've got to be rigid, but I do think that equity, it ought to reflect the population. For example, in 1975, I drew the reapportionment plan for the city of Montgomery. I drew 4 majority black districts, but I really drew 3, and 1 district got to be majority black because of Judge Johnson's decision and the Carr decision that moved all the whites out of Ridgecrest, and told them to go to Carver School, and a lot of whites left. So that was an impact. But now blacks are a majority, and I think that blacks ought to have a majority of city council. I'm right now, and I'm just as soon as I get through some other things, we're gonna take it on. I worked with some blacks and drawing the reapportionment plan this time around, recently last month, and they came in and worked with me on it. And then when they got ready to vote. They voted against the plan they had agreed to. Well, because the Republicans came up with a plan that gives Republicans a better chance of maintaining control of the Montgomery City Council. That's a different issue, except to say that we'll see that again. So it depends on what the drafter wants and what the voters want.
That brings me to
Governor
another
Biden.
question, and this question could be fielded by either you, Attorney Tanner, or you, Dr. Reed, and that is, has there been any concerted, real efforts at bipartisan or multiracial efforts to sit down and really in a earnest way attempt to come up with an equitable redistricting plan, or is it always adversarial and contentious?
I think the answer is sometimes it's more adversarial and contentious than others, but it can get pretty contentious. I've worked on the redistricting, state legislative and congressional redistricting in Texas, where there are two major minority groups of Black and Latino groups, and also in Houston, the large Asian American community. And as in other, the California and other states, there's a lot of tension between the Black and Latino interests. Everyone's fighting for power and dividing up a limited pie. And so they're the elbows going out. I would add one thing about Dr. Reed, about packing. And there's some tension in there. The one way is to keep the Black majorities at the barely enough to ensure the election of a Black candidate. And that gets you in some places more white allies, because you have more districts with enough Black population to ally with white persons of goodwill to get elected, and you get closer to what you want in the legislature is a majority, 50+1. On the other hand, that the thinner you cut it, the more danger there is that you'll lose a person who's representing you, is representing the Black community, as opposed to the wealthier liberal whites who have their own agenda that is not perfectly coextensive with the interests of the Black community. And so you need, I think of Alvin Holmes, who had a very large Black majority, and he needed it to maintain his aggressive advocacy. And I also recall that Earl Hilliard, who was a member of Congress from the one majority Black district in Alabama, who did something to get affluent white people upset. And so they put a lot of money in, and he got beat by Arthur Davis, who turned into not a good representative of the Black community in Alabama. So there's balancing there, and people should get along together. But
one point, John, well taken, because Alvin didn't want any white folk in this district at all. He wanted 100% Black district all the time, but he needed a good cushion, and he always got a good cushion. The only whites he tolerated were putting Maxwell Air Force Base in his district. He could tolerate Maxwell, but beyond that, it didn't bother him. But on a more serious note, one of the things that I found, and it was a reapportionment plan that we were putting in the Alabama legislature. I struck a deal with Jimmy Clark, and I found out one thing: when you're doing legislative reapportionment, the first thing you do, you got to satisfy the movers and the shakers and decision makers in that process. Jimmy Clark had been chairman of the Sovereignty Commission, and we know what that was about. And there were 4 plans out there. It might have been 5, but at least I know at least 4. And all the plans messed Jimmy Clark's district up, but one. That was mine. I went to the speaker and said, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to draw some districts. But before I draw any district, I want to draw your district first. I want to be sure you're satisfied. Well, the thing, he didn't want Barber County cut up, because Barber County had been cut up earlier in 4 or 5 different districts. He didn't want Barber County cut up. I said, now, you know, I got to get some black districts now. Oh, yeah, Joe, go on, get your black districts. Go on, get them there. I understand that. But I don't want Barber County cut up. But I went and drew the plan. The first thing I drew was his district, gave him all of Barber County and East Henry County. I went back to him and said, Mr. Speaker, here is your district plan. I want to see if you're satisfied. He said, yeah. Looked at it. I said, all the Barbers together. You got East Henry. Oh, he said, Joe, this is a good plan. Well, I knew I'd satisfied him. Then the point I'm trying to make is that I also told him, I said, now the black district, I'm going to handle that. And the white district, you want some changes made, you have to, I'm going to send them to you, and you tell me whether you want the changes made or not. I got 8 additional majority black districts. 8. So I carried the plan to him, and he told me that he liked that idea. And every time somebody come to him, I don't know what he told him, but then he'll call me and say, help him out if you can. Well, I helped 2 or 3 people out. And Jim, if you listen to this, you remember Victor Gaston down in Mobile. He was Taylor Harper's cousin. Taylor Harper said, well, look, Victor needs some help, and he wants this and this and this. Can you give it to him? I said, fine with me. I don't get it. I got my 8 black districts. And then it got down to Butler County. That's what we made some changes there. Both of those guys agreed to their own districts based on them meeting with me. And the point I'm trying to make, when it came to voting against the plan, they both voted against the plan, even though their district was made just like they wanted. What's my point? My point is, what I have found, to my dismay, I have not found, whether they're Democrats or what, I haven't found many Democrats. I found very, 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 very few who are willing to coalesce with blacks to get anything as it relates to reapportionment and redistricting. We just my experience has been really almost nil.
That was a segue to my next question, and I really, sitting here listening, and I'm wondering, recently we're hearing the Senate have hearings on the newest nominee to the Supreme Court, Brown Jackson, and she gave a speech about that King. She reiterated or emphasized a speech given by King about a colorblind society, and so when in essence, has America arrived in this post-racial or colorblind environment, and so when I think about Alabama, what are the indications that there has anything changed in the way that the Black and white communities in Alabama see political representation? It seems to be as adversarial today as it was in the 1980s or the 1970s. And I'm just talking about in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act. So is there any place to look in the state of Alabama where you see interracial cooperation, in terms of redistricting and representation? And either one of you could answer that question. And I think you've already been touching on it, Dr. Reed.
Well, certainly there's more tolerance. The resistance is not as strong. And I think now that you will find that policymakers, now that blacks are there, they accept the fact and they will draw district lines to accommodate those blacks that are there. I saw one thing that happened recently in Alabama reapportionment plan that was passed the House of Representatives, House District 74. Now somehow the Republicans want to take a majority black district and make it white, but then what they did, they took a majority white district and made it black. Well, I would say, let me say it another way. They took a district that was represented by a white Republican, because the population has shifted some. And that may be one of the factors, but now the district is a majority black district, and that was in Montgomery, District 74. That district is a majority black district now. But that district was, and still is, as we speak now, is represented by a Republican. But the population shifted so much in Montgomery. But that's the only, but I don't think it was done in things that, quote, advance blacks at all. I think it was done to advance other purposes. I just have not found any significant signs. Now, the blacks who are there, yes, they're there because you got guys like Jim Blackshield, John Tanner, and a lot of the rest of us in the Alabama Democratic Conference all sitting out in the wings, ready to fight if you try to give up, try to take some of these black seats. So to that extent, I call that toleration, political toleration. I think if they thought they could do and get away with it, there wouldn't be a single black there, because when they in the legislature now, the black legislators are complaining that the Republicans get together and they get an agenda and they just voted, notwithstanding what the blacks have. So I don't see any black sympathy or any black tolerance in the way these Republicans, way these whites vote. Because you can't say blacks, because white Democrats are going to have but two in the whole legislature, two white Democrats, one in the House and one in the Senate. So I don't see a massive, now I should say massive, I see very little change, but I do see some tolerance.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Attorney Tanner?
Well, I think the level of tolerance over the years, certainly since 1965, is just a completely different world. Mm-hmm. In 2010, I went to one of those community fairs in Hueytown, which is, as you know, an industrial suburb. It's where all the race car drivers come from, predominantly white area. And I was there, and a black man walked in with a white woman. And it occurred to me that in, 1963, he would have been shot. And that's just a fact.
Absolutely.
Now, everyone went up to him and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And they're part of the community. And redistricting is about power. It really is. And I think that one reason that the legislature may have done what they did with District 74 is because of the increase and expansion of black population in Montgomery. They had to do something with the population, and who cares if they have another district? It doesn't matter for power in the legislature. And if we don't create the district, they're going to have to go into one of our districts, and no one wants to take people who are going to vote against them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we touched on earlier, and I wanted to revisit, and that is this idea of redistricting as the political gerrymandering as opposed to racial gerrymandering. And so it seems to me that there are places around the United States where district lines are drawn really for partisan reasons. Is it that race continues to be the defining feature in Alabama, or is it because the majority of Democrats are black, and the majority of Republicans are white, so that it takes on a racial composition. Or can you all discuss that?
Well, I think that there are both dimensions to it, and it's all about power. Again, I keep saying that, but it is, and it's about control. And there are elements of there are inherent elements in that because of the solid Democratic voting patterns of the Black community, in which, certainly one way, and usually a very good way, of wielding power or wielding influence. And but then, if they would be happy to do the same thing to solid Democratic areas in that are heavily white. That there wouldn't be the same animus, if you will, but they do it all over Maryland, including very white areas, and it's the Democrats doing it there to try and keep from any Republicans getting elected to Congress.
So manipulating the redistricting process for political or even racial purposes is really a component of our political system that is it here to stay? Is that our assessment?
Well, I think as long as the racial lines are divided as they are, and in Alabama, you can pretty much tell if someone's a Democrat or Republican with fair accuracy on sight. Then it's just hard to chisel it away. I think it's going to take a political reorientation on either or both sides, really, or we get onto issues where folks can agree on more. One thing we've seen in the Latino community is, which is less solidly Democratic, is a good bit of erosion just recently in the last 4-8 years, I guess 4-5 years, in support for the Democratic Party. And I think my guess, and I haven't studied this carefully, is that because of the general lack of enthusiasm or lessening of enthusiasm on the part of working people, working class people, for the Democratic Party.
I think that I would like to turn to one of the questions posed by a viewer, and that people who are looking to gain more information and to understand the political process and the redistricting process more intimately, what would you suggest? How would you suggest that they inform? Where do they seek information? Where can they acquire information about the political process and redistricting? What are the ideal sources from your standpoint? And this is to either Dr. Reed or Attorney Tanner.
Well, I'd tell them to go down to the ADC headquarters and to get involved, because my experience in enforcing the Voting Rights Act is, if you're part of an organization, you've got a bigger say. And as an attorney, I mentioned at the outset, my job was to dig and get facts. And the best way to do that is to work with organizations like the ADC, who have people on the ground who can go out and get the facts. I had one of my very first lawsuits was out in Conecuh County, where I believe Dr. Reed's from. And they have a wonderful organization there. Larry Fluker and Mr. Jerome Gray were down there at the time. And they wouldn't appoint black poll workers. And so we had federal observers down there, and they got facts, and we were building a case. And the next election, they Mr. Fluker, I believe, indicated that some of the poll workers were related to candidates, which is against the law in Alabama. And, they're all white. So I said, well, couldn't you get people who would be willing to serve as poll workers, good people? And so they went to the ADC, got a list of, there were 23 of the people that had relatives. They got a list of 23 black poll workers, potential black poll workers. I think that they're all probably AEA members, and presented it to the county, and the county rejected it. And we used that. That was a key fact in getting a court order to appoint black poll workers in the polling places in Conecuh County. And afterwards, Mr. Gray took me up to see Dr. Reed and told him about the case. And Dr. Reed said, Jerome, let's do this everywhere. And, they did the legwork. They went out and got the facts and worked with Jim Blacksher and Larry Menifee, and had the Burton v. Hop, one Burton v.
Harris versus Graddick.
Harris versus Graddick, and Harris versus Sigmund is a fight, and they got a model order. And I tell you, before that case, we would send 1,000 federal observers to watch the polls in Alabama to deter discriminatory conduct and to document it. And now we never do. Justice Department never do. I mean, it dropped off the table because, once you had integrated teams and black captains or whatever you call the head poll worker in the majority black precincts, it changed behavior hugely. And I think that increased turnout a lot. People knew they weren't going to get messed with. And that's what we vote.
I want to ask a question. Actually, one of our viewers asked a question about increasing voter turnout. But what that really prompts me to think about is, in terms of these models, how accurate are the predictive models in terms of determining the potential voter turnout or the actual voter turnout in these districts? And it seems like, it's particularly on off-year elections, but even in a number of local elections, that voter turnout is very, very low.
Well, I'm sure there are different answers and different reasons, but the two things that come to my mind that increase voter turnout, you give them something to vote for that they really think is going to matter. It's going to help. I think that is too extreme almost. You give them something to vote for, people go out and they'll do it. More of them will vote. And you give them something to vote against. If they got something to vote against, it's unfortunate, but they seem like to me the good issues don't get the attention that the bad issues do. Some of the good issues. But if they got something, a rallying cry. I remember back in 1985, we had a big turnout. I mean, we had some others since that time. When Ronald Reagan was running, there was something about him that whites turned out for him and blacks turned out against him. But I think having something to vote for and having people that want to do something, want somebody, they got to have this drive, and it takes a while. You can't do it in a week. You have to work. You have to work it up. That, to me, and I'm sure there are many other reasons that people go out and not vote, then I just mentioned here, but I think people being excited for or against something oftentimes is a driving point. Give them something to vote for. They need to know that. And oftentimes, even that's what you say, white Democrats. You got to give well, y'all gonna turn them out for what? For what? Yeah, you gonna turn them out? You haven't given up anything to turn out for. Why should they haven't through that? I'm a Democrat, so what? You haven't given them any you haven't given blacks any major reason to want to be running out and voting for you. And when, because you get them on the street, as I told some judges one time, hell, you keep sitting there by the prison, you ain't have nobody to vote for you. But
we're gonna end our program on that note. What we wanted to do today, have a conversation that looked at the redistricting process and also explain some aspects of the gerrymandering process and how integral that was to the redistricting process that the United States goes through after every decennial census. And so we've just gone through a census. And so redistricting is an issue that's occurring all throughout this nation. And so in Alabama, of course, there's a redistricting plan that has been proposed by the state legislature. And there's, again, opposition to that plan by the NAACP, by State Senator Bobby Singleton, by Eric Holder's group. So there's several groups that are charging that the state of Alabama and the Alabama legislature has drawn districts that disadvantage the African American population. So this is again a sort of a consistent theme, and so what we wanted to do was to have our first program look at some of the issues post the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and so Attorney Tanner and Dr. Reed has done that for us. In part two, we'll have political scientist D. Lionel Finley, who will moderate a panel discussion, which will include James U. Blackshear, that Dr. Reed has mentioned, and Mr. Tanner has mentioned on several occasions. Bernard Simelton, the president of the Alabama State Conference of NAACP. Bobby Singleton, again, Attorney Bobby Singleton, who is the minority leader in the Alabama State Senate. This panel will look closely at the process of redistricting in the aftermath of the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder case. And that Supreme Court case really gutted or rendered unconstitutional Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which is the formula that identified those states or parts of states that were subject to pre-clearance. And so without that pre-clearance criteria, we see a whole litany or spat of voting laws that are arguably in place to diminish the voting by language minorities or racial minorities. And so this is what the litigation contends. And so this second program coming up on Thursday will look at the legal challenges and the other redistricting proposals by the state legislature. So tune in Thursday, and until then, we're going to have again Dr. Carl Pettis, the provost of Alabama State University, give us some closing remarks.
Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending today's Voting Rights Lecture Series that examined issues of redistricting and gerrymandering. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation of this program hosted by the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture here at ASU. As Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Alabama State University, I would like to thank our distinguished guests and moderators, the National Center staff and its steering committee, for their work to host today's event. We would like to thank all of you in our audience for your support of the National Center, and we invite you to attend all of the events of this series that celebrate the history of the voting rights movement and today's focus on social justice. Please be sure to join us for future informative and provocative National Center programs. Again, thank you.